Hi, my name is Megan. Thank you all for coming and attending my senior TED Talk. So they say in natural foods that God never packs the poison without the antidote. With our fructose comes fiber. Yet in writing, it often feels like we can't pack the social antidote without a dose of poison. Otherwise, the message is distrusted or rejected as dull. To bring the right dose of poison in the right way, while leaving a lasting impression that brings the social discourse forwards, is the skill of a great artist, a great writer. The only way to truly teach is with great stories, and in fantasy, it can become even more vital to learn and more worthwhile. Fantasy fiction, in my opinion, is one of the greatest, the most important genres, as it allows for people and kids to explore the world around them while exciting them with curiosity and imagination. More oftentimes than not, while reading fantasy, people will begin to analyze the world around them with a new pair of eyes, asking questions that can be crucial to our lives, while also allowing for an escape. It makes us dream of bigger things without the constant what-ifs nagging in the back of our minds. The sky is essentially the limit. Since the 20th century, with books like Lord of the Rings heavily influencing fantasy writing, the fantasy genre has become more and more popular. In 2017, more than 350 million people read fantasy fiction, coming in with a sales revenue of around $590.2 million, ranking in fourth with the sales. Due to the inclination of fantasy fiction and my personal favoritism toward the genre, I wanted to research.
It's on. Okay, there you go. That should work now. Point it at the computer.
I wanted to research what makes a good fantasy short story. In order to do this and to gain a better understanding of what fantasy short stories include, I read and analyzed 5 different fantasy short stories. The Pelican Bar from the short story collection book What I Didn't See by Karen Joy Fowler, Icing the Body Electric by Ray Bradbury, Pol Pot's Beautiful Daughter by Jeff Ryman, My Life as a Swan from Tanith Lee's short story collection book Redder Than Blood, and The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. From these stories, I found that like a well-built bridge that is supported with strong, sturdy beams, a short story must have the same kind of support through the use of the elements of themes, characters, and setting. Without one of those, the bridge can collapse, leaving you with a story that feels empty and unfulfilling. For the purpose of this TED Talk, I will only be talking about the short stories Icing the Body Electric and The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, as they are the best examples of incorporating those 3 elements effectively. To start, theme in literature is defined as a main idea or an underlying meaning of literary work, which may be stated as indirectly or directly. Themes in fantasy are important because they are the whole heart of the story, the underlying meaning or message that can teach us great lessons in life. Common themes in works of fantasy include love and death, good versus evil, sacrifice, and magic. Despite the fact that it is fantasy fiction, the story should still feel real. A perfect example of this would be in the short story Icing the Body Electric, as the theme is created by having a family dynamic filled with love but powered by death. The theme of death is presented in the story when we find out that the mother had died and the family starts to need help around the house to help take care of the 3 children, Tom, Timothy, and Agatha. That is when they then decide to buy an electrical grandmother. Tom, Timothy, and the father instantly love the grandmother, but Agatha is distant and untrusting towards her as she's afraid she's going to leave them just like her mother did. Here's an excerpt of how the theme of love is presented in the story. Quote, "Can one love someone so much you hate them? Dumb, of course. It is sticking your neck out, sure. I guess you hate people when they make you feel naked. I mean, sort of on the spot or out in the open. That's the way to play the game, of course. I mean, you don't just love people, you must love them with exclamation points." End quote. The use of these 2 themes are powerful throughout the rest of the story because it has a sense of reality that pulls you into the story. The strong family dynamic that also deals with real-world stuff, love, and death. If Bradbury were to just use one of those themes, the story wouldn't be as convincing. To help strengthen the theme, Bradbury creates the character of the electrical grandmother, who is wise and teaches an important lesson on loss, supporting the theme of death. Quote, "So your mother ran away to death, and after that, how could you trust anyone? If everyone left, vanished finally, Who was there to trust? I should have known. So when I came, half wise, half ignorant, I should have known. I did not know why you would not accept me. For very simply and honestly, you feared I might not stay, that I lied, that I was vulnerable too. And 2 leave takings, 2 deaths were one too many in a single year. End quote. This character is the type of person people want to be like, being empathetic towards the other characters in the story while also subtly reinforcing the theme, reminding us to be understanding in the face of loss. But what exactly is so important about characters in works of fantasy, you may ask? Well, good character development helps set the story up for success, as they are also able to teach lessons in life such as dealing with hard situations. Powerful characters are characters that readers can connect and relate to, as they make the readers feel more like they are part of the story rather than just reading it. Characters that are able to build a relationship not only with the readers, but also with the other characters in the story and build off of each other, provide a sense of realism that keeps the audience engaged. This can happen through sympathy, empathy, and humor. Though, conflict between the theme and the characters can become difficult, especially when the theme demands a heavy presence, which is oftentimes found more in fantasy. The theme of fantasy calls for unnatural scenarios that characters may have to face, but they still should act in a way that makes sense to the theme, so it's important to have a theme that can be in support with the characters, making them act in a way that would make sense to the theme, which would ultimately create a good work of fantasy writing. And lastly is setting. Setting in fantasy short stories are key as you're building and constructing the world and the society that your characters will be living in, and the cultures that surround them. With setting, you're painting a colorful picture into the reader's minds with black and white words. Although it is important to remember that setting is not just the location. It can also help set the story's moods based off of the surroundings of the story. A successful setting in works of fantasy ultimately come down to whether or not you can clearly see what is going on in your mind and can get a feeling of the mood the author is portraying. And most importantly, you have to consider if whether or not your characters are a good fit in the location and the setting that you're writing. I Sing the Body Electric does a great job of this, specifically with portraying the mood. Quote, "There are the roller skates that belong to a boy, me, who will never be that young again. And yes, there the tires swing on the old oak, but Agatha afraid to swing. It would surely break. It would fall. And the house, oh God, we peered through the front door, afraid of the echoes we might find confused in the halls, the sort of clamor that happens when all the furniture is taken out and there is nothing to soften the river of talk that flows in any house at all hours. And now the soft, the warm, the main piece of lovely furniture gone forever." From this particular scene in writing, we get the feeling of loss supporting the theme of death. And from Agatha being afraid to swing, we see that she is afraid of trusting and letting go, as seen when the electrical grandmother was talking to her, which also supports the characters. In this story, the use of those 3 elements, supporting and reinforcing one another, makes a strong connection throughout, making it an engaging story because each element relates and strengthens one another, creating a society that makes sense to the characters living in it. Now in the story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Amalez, there's an awful secret in the city that everyone knows about. A child in constant pain and misery. It's the only way for the city to thrive in happiness is if this child suffers. And from that, every person in Amalez has to confront the truth of their child in a coming-of-age ritual from the city of Amalez. Some people are horrified by what is being done to the child, so they walk away from Amalez and never return, while others stay. The story is essentially a perfect society where everyone is happy and equal, except for the one child who is always suffering. The theme of this story is the nature of happiness, making us question if happiness is truly happiness, if it is based off of someone else's misery, or whether or not the happiness of the bigger group outweighs the misery of one person. Quote, "They all know it is there, all the people of Amalez. Some of them have come to see it, others are content merely knowing it is there. They all know that it has to be there. Some of them understand why, and some do not. But they all understand that their happiness, the beauty of their city, the tenderness of their friendships, the health of their children, the wisdom of their scholars, the skill of their makers, even the abundance of their harvest and the kindly weathers of their skies, depend wholly on this child's abdominal misery." End quote. So it is determined that the citizens' overall happiness is more important than the one child's suffering. So the people who live in the city aren't treated individually, but rather as a whole, while the child who is suffering is the only one treated as an individual. What makes this theme so successful throughout the story is that it poses the truth the thought of truth that is held in our reality and our society of what we think perfect is and what that may look like. Now, the setting in this story is super beneficial to the theme because we get a visual of what the perfect city of Almaz looks like. Quote, far off to the north and west, the mountain stood up, half encircling Almaz on her bay. The air of morning was so clear that the snow still crowning the 18 peaks burned with white gold fire across the miles of sunlit air under the dark blue sky. There was just enough wind to make the banners that marked the racecourse snap and flutter now and then. In the silence of the city streets, farther and nearer and ever approaching, a cheerful faint sweetness of the air that from time to time trembled and gathered, and broke out into the great joyous changing of the bells. End quote. The setting used is in perfect contrast to the theme, supporting and strengthening the overall message of the perfect society, giving us the visual of what the city looks like. Now, the characters in the story is interesting because it could be seen as two different things, either the citizens of Almaz as a whole or the child suffering. Either way, they each support the theme and the setting of the story as it shows the happiness of the citizens and the misery of the child. Quote, in the room, a child is sitting. It could be a boy or a girl. It looks about 6, but actually is nearly 10. It is feeble-minded. Perhaps it was born defective, or perhaps it has become imbecile through fear, malnutrition, or neglect. It picks its nose and occasionally fumbles vaguely with its toes or genitals as it sits hunched in the corner farthest from the bucket and the 2 mops. It is afraid of the mops. It finds them horrible. It shuts its eyes but knows the mops are still standing there, and the door is locked, and nobody will come. The door is always locked, and nobody ever comes. Except that sometimes the child has no understanding of time or interval. Sometimes the door rattles terrible and opens, and a person or several people are there. End quote. The way that this character supports the theme is that it shows that the child is in fact in a constant state of misery in order for the whole of Almaz to be happy. And it strengthens the setting because it proves that just because a place looks happy and perfect doesn't mean it is. As for the citizens of Almaz, it becomes more and more prevalent throughout the story that they aren't fond of the child's suffering, even though they know that it needs to be there in order for their society to thrive. Quote, yet it is their tears and anger, the trying of their generosity, and the acceptance of their helplessness which are perhaps the true source of the splendor of their lives. Theirs is no vapid, irresponsible happiness. They know that they, like the child, are not free. They know compassion. It is the existence of the child and their knowledge of its existence that makes possible the nobility of their architecture, the poignancy of their music, the profundity of their science. It is because of the child that they are so gentle with children. They know that if the wretched one were not there sniveling in the dark, the other one, the flute player, could make joyful music as the young riders line up in their beauty for the race in the sunlight of the first morning of summer. End quote. The characters as the citizens as a whole works with the theme because it reinforces the idea that in order for there to be an overall happiness, someone does have to suffer, even if they are aware of that suffering. And what makes this short story so engaging is the fact that it makes you think outside of the box a little, making you wonder is that really what a perfect society would have to be or look like in order for it to be perfect and happy? This short story is also proof that using the elements of theme, character, and setting to work together and build off of each other creates a vision in the story that is creative in complexity and engaging to the audience. From these stories, it is evident that these 3 elements are most important in producing a good fantasy story. Theme because it gives meaning to the story, characters because they are what keep the story going, they are who the readers live through and can teach very valuable lessons, and the setting because that is where everything is taking place. It's what makes the story come to life, being able to visualize what is taking place in the story and the feelings that go along with it. Creating a fantasy story that combines all 3 of those elements that work together and support and strengthen each other will ultimately make a good fantasy short story. Thank you.
Check it out. All right, thank you, Megan.
Thank you.
So we're going to open up to questions. Audience members, please feel free to ask Megan questions, and then panelists, obviously, as well.
Not all at once. Yes, Larry.
Have you ever read, and this could be either for your thesis or outside of your thesis, have you ever read a story that you would call successful that breaks these rules or that has one of these things that is weaker?
Yeah. I've definitely read a lot even the other stories that I read, like The Pelican Bar and My Life as a Swan, they definitely had the elements of theme and character more than they would in setting, and that still makes the story good, but they still have like that little bit of theme that like helps keep the story going, and it still makes it good. It's just like they all support each other. Yeah, Kat?
I just, like, I know you focus on short stories. In relation to longer novels, is it a similar, did you look into that, or can you relate, is that a very similar trend that you find in fantasy novels as well?
Yeah. Actually, before this project, I never read like a fantasy short story. It's always been like books because I love books. And yeah, all of those elements are definitely in like the larger novels, and they need to be. I feel like in bigger books, like they need to be stronger and like more supportive of each other to keep like the story going. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
As you turn your eyes, obviously you're going to be writing short stories or a short story, for your senior project. So as you turn your eyes forward to that, which of these things do you think is going to be easiest for you to develop, and which one do you think is going to be hardest, and why, in the short story format?
I feel like probably the theme is going to be the hardest, just because I want it to be able to support and like strengthen the characters in the setting, and I haven't really figured out like how I'm going to do that exactly. And I think that the characters in the setting are going to be the easiest, just because it's like it's a person, and like I know what they're going to do and what I want them to do and what I want to happen. And the setting, just because I'm more descriptive when I'm writing, so that will just come easy, like naturally. Keisha?
Have you thought about what you want to write your short story about?
No. Not exactly. I have a few ideas, but not one that I'm just like, oh, like I'm so excited for right now. Lori?
When you write, do you tend to start with that big sort of more abstract idea, or do you tend to start with like a character in a situation, or like how do those ideas start for you?
I usually start with like a character and like how I want the character to be, and then I start to like build where that's going to be happening, and then I kind of just go from there. So usually in specific like situations that are happening, I usually start with that and then kind of build around it.
So you kind of like write your way into the theme.
Yeah. Jack?
Yes, out of these three, which one would you say is the most important, or are they all three of them equally as important in a short story?
Personally, I think that the theme is more important, just because, again, it is the heart of the story. It's like the message that the author is ultimately trying to like get out to the readers. So I do think that the theme is the most important, but I do think character and setting are still important.
Any final questions?
Katie?
How did you choose the 5 books to read for your thesis?
Lori sent me an article of the best fantasy and science fiction short story of all time, and I just kind of picked things from there. I didn't get all of them from there. Other ones I just did my own research on, and I was like, that sounds interesting, so I just would read it.
What did you think about when you picked them? Like, what were some of the criteria that you were using?
It was kind of hard because a lot of them were like science fiction, and I was like, but I need fantasy. But I just kind of picked ones that I knew would have those specific elements in them specifically. Like with Pol Pot's Beautiful Daughter, I knew that it would have a strong character. With My Life as a Swan, I knew that the theme would be very prevalent. And the other two, I Sing the Body Electric and The Ones Who Walk Away from Amalas, I just chose them from the thing that you sent me, because I've never heard of those.
All right, we're going to end questioning there. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you.
If you will step outside, we'll call you.